Now, this same idea applies here. We're going to break apart the 40 into multiplication using perfect squares. And so we can see that 40 is the same thing as 4, which is 2 squared times 10. So we are going to substitute 40 as 4 times 10x cubed. And now we know that 4 is the same thing as 2 squared, so we're going to go ahead and make that quick substitution real quick. Now, this x cubed right here, we can split it apart as x squared times x, and it means the same thing. And the reason we want to do this is because you're going to see that we can pull out these x squareds in a second. So if we take the square root of 2 squared times 10 times x squared times x, then we can pull out our separate multiplication so that it leaves us with the square root of 2 squared times the square root of 10 times the square root of x squared times the square root of x. And the square root of 2 squared is just 2. We have the square root of 10 still under its house, under that radicand. And if we take the square root of x squared, that leaves us with x. Remember that the square root and squared act against each other. And then this square root x can't be taken, so it has to stay underneath the radicand. And since we're dealing with square roots, we're going to have plus or minus on the outside. Let's do the same thing right here with 45x. We can see that 45 is the same thing as 9 times 5. And 9 is a perfect square. It's the same thing as 3 squared. So we are going to substitute that multiplication in as 9 times 5 times x. And 9 we said was the same thing as the square root of 3 squared times 5 times x. And if we split this multiplication up at this point, we can take the square root of 3 squared times the square root of 5x. Since neither of these have a squared, I'm just going to leave them underneath the radicand. Now, the square root of 3 squared is the same thing as 3. The square root of 5x is just the square root of 5x. And since we're dealing with square roots, can't forget the plus minus. Let's take a look at 56x squared. So if we're looking at 56x squared, we know that 56 is the same thing as 4 times 14. So what I did was I divided it by these perfect squares to see what I could find. And 4 times 14 is the same thing as 56. So we're going to do a little substituting. 4 times 14 times x squared. Now, since 4 is the same thing as 2 squared, I'm going to substitute in 2 squared times 14 times x squared. And then we're going to break apart this multiplication. So I can take the square root of 2 squared times the square root of 14 times the square root of x squared. And the square root of 2 squared is just 2. We can't take the square root of 14 any further, so we're going to leave square root 14 underneath the house, underneath that radicand. And then this square root of x squared is x. And don't forget your plus minus out to the side. And then these have been simplified.